Good afternoon, everyone. I'm DDP Tri, President and CEO of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, managing partner of Olmsted 200. It's great to see you as we close out 2022 and look ahead to 2023. Frederick Law Olmsted will turn 201 in only a few months, and we'll be ready. As we've said all along, Olmsted 200 is not a sepia-toned celebration. It's the start of a continuing conversation about the issues that Olmsted cared about: equity, access, sustainability, and democratic spaces. This year, our celebration has crossed continents and inspired reinvestment in parks and places across the country. Thanks to you, the bicentennial has motivated people to champion Olmsted's vision of parks for all people. Today, we'll revisit just a few of the high points of 2022 and look to the new year. Please stay with us to watch a recap of the year and to hear an exciting announcement about the future of the National Association for Olmsted Parks. We'll be debuting a new website in April 2023, but until then, please continue visiting olmsted200.org, where you can find ever-changing events on the calendar and blog. If you haven't already, join our mailing list and follow us on social media, where we regularly highlight events, blogs, recorded programs, and more. And let me say, what a year it has been. Thanks to you, Olmsted 200 has inspired more than 500 programs and engaged hundreds and hundreds of organizations across the globe. We owe special thanks to the honorary committee and to our 10 national partners who have been deeply involved for over 2 years. We also thank Oak Spring Garden Foundation for the great exhibit, Frederick Law Olmsted Landscapes for the Public Good. This is an evergreen exhibit, and we urge everyone to find places to display it in 2023. And for your holiday giving, check out the treasure trove of new books on Olmsted. And if your mother-in-law is getting on your nerves, that's a perfect time to catch up with all the conversations with Olmsted you missed on our YouTube channel on Olmsted 200. In addition to a massive number of programs, we've also had massive media attention, from social media posts to radio, TV, and newspaper coverage. And frankly, it doesn't get better than the remarkable photo essay by New York Times photographer Ruth Fremson. We also loved her follow-up piece titled "An Assignment I Needed: Frederick Law Olmsted's Legacy." Olmsted 200 has also garnered attention from many public officials. In April, cities and states across the country proclaimed Frederick Law Olmsted Day. 2 streets were named for Olmsted, one in Staten Island and one in Milwaukee's Washington Park. And one of the most interesting surprises of Olmsted 200, in New York, the Rochester Zoo named a giraffe after Frederick Law Olmsted, calling him Olmy for short. And of course, we couldn't recap 2022 without mentioning Frederick Law Olmsted himself, or specifically, Big Head Fred. He made his debut on the eve of Olmsted's 200th birthday in Central Park, meeting none other than Martha Stewart. Since then, he's been traveling from coast to coast, visiting cities and schools. If you would like to bring him to your community, please let us know. On a more serious note, this year has marked an extraordinary renewal of interest in Olmsted parks and landscapes and the principles behind them. We have been heartened by municipal investments, public-private partnerships, creative community collaborations, and so much more. We look forward to 2023 as we continue to advance these long-term projects and work to ensure Olmsted landscapes thrive for the next generation. I hope you watched our opening slideshow, where we showcase just a few of the many efforts to restore and renew Olmsted landscapes. These landscapes are not projects for a day or a week. These are long-term projects that require our dedication and sustained support. That's why the National Association for Olmsted Parks exists, and it's why we hope that all of you will help us in 2023 as we build on the excitement and energy of the bicentennial campaign. It's our belief that community, life, and environmental outcomes can all be improved through the thoughtful application and advancement of Olmsted work and principles. With that in mind, it's my pleasure today to introduce three fantastic stars in the Olmsted universe who are on the front lines of applying these principles: Layla George, Michael Carriere, and Haven Kears. These three individuals represent key constituencies in the Olmsted network: Olmsted Parks, which give us our tagline, Parks for All People, Olmsted Community Builders, and the higher education community. The pandemic has underscored what happens when we do not ensure park access to all people. Low-income communities and communities of color suffer dearly in terms of health outcomes when equitable access is lacking, perpetuating existing racial and economic divides. That's why we're so pleased to hear shortly from Layla George, who will talk about how Louisville is building its Olmsted Parks. The Olmsted Parks Conservancy recently announced the addition of 25 acres to the existing Olmsted Park system with the development of Beargrass Preserve. Joining Layla is Michael Carriere, a professor at the Milwaukee School of Engineering, who has been focused on Olmsted Parks in Milwaukee. We know all too well, not all Olmsted Parks are thriving or appreciated. That's why one of the long-term goals of the bicentennial has been to bring renewed attention to parks and landscapes which are on hard times, whether threatened by neglect, lack of funds, development, or climate change. A promising story comes to us from Milwaukee, where the bicentennial has fostered renewed interest in the city's rich but sometimes deteriorating Olmsted heritage. City leaders have announced a multi-million-dollar feasibility study to explore how to reunite Washington Park, which was divided by a freeway several decades ago. Late this summer, Michael testified on behalf of naming the Olmsted Way in Washington Park, and he moderated a panel earlier this year that explored how Olmsted 200 can lead to a reinvention and rebirth of Olmsted's ideas. Finally, in the ring today for the academic community is Professor Haven Kears at UC Davis. As you will see, and that is intended as a pun, Haven has brought a bit of fun to the Olmsted celebration while showing students how Olmsted can provide fresh and important insights on resilience and sustainability. Welcome to you all. Over the next few minutes, we look forward to exploring how we can reimagine the enduring legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted. So let me start with Layla. So here we are, Layla, 200 years after Olmsted's birth, still honoring the Olmsted legacy. Why do Olmsted's work and ideas still matter? What makes Olmsted Parks special? And how do we take these ideas and apply them to future park making?
Well, I think 2020 showed all of us how important parks were. Those of us in the park world already knew that, but I think the public at large really found such solace in our park spaces. I'd like to tell people, I think it was when Olmsted's vision was truly realized, you know, with the pandemic, and it was healthy, fresh air, and also just a mental escape for everyone. So here in Louisville and even Southern Indiana, our neighbors across the river, we have been expanding. Not only our expansion, but public parks in both states have added property recently that they'll be building on. So I hope that this is a new trend that we'll see here in Louisville, not just with us, but the city at large, to add more public park space. We, of course, are adding 25 acres. And it is an interesting time because it's not technically an Olmsted design space, but it is adjacent to one and must speak to that and have a direct relationship while being a little bit distinct because we are managing this ourselves, which is unique. The other parks that we have in Louisville are all maintained by the city with support from us. So it's a design challenge that we look forward to exploring. The next process is we will be embarking on a master plan. So in January, we hope to begin that planning process and invite the public to work with us to see really what this landscape can become.
Well, it's so interesting too, Layla, because I think there's a sense today that we can't grow our parks. And here's exact evidence that, in fact, you can do that. And I'm curious to talk a little bit more about the regional park approach that you all have taken. I know we think about Olmsted thinking at the scale of the problem and thinking big and system-wide. So I'm curious about how the communities are thinking about that as well.
Well, I think some of the properties that have been added here locally were places where they weren't able to be developed. Perhaps it was floodplain land that has had issues in the past, and so they're now converting it to park spaces, which is also something that we see in our Olmsted parks. I mean, we have two parks that are kind of this really interesting topography, and they weren't buildable, which is why they became parks. So we see examples like that. We also have some space across the river, about 400 acres, that is being converted to a big park. And what I love is that a lot of these are really trying to mirror the Olmsted design principles that we have. They see our Olmsted park system as the original park system. We have the Parklands development, which is about 4,000 acres as kind of an outer ring that is our Olmsted parks for the next generations. And then we also see it across the river. So people really are thinking in terms of Olmsted design principles, which is wonderful.
That's just fantastic news. And for that, I'm going to turn to Michael in Milwaukee. Obviously, you come from a great state that loves football. It welcomes high-profile football and basketball teams. When we think back to Olmsted's day, city leaders like Christian Wall were coveting parks and parks by the Olmsted. So I'd like to explore with you, Michael, a little bit. I mean, how can parks become an equally desired part of community well-being and development today?
That's a good question. I think at the root of that is the idea that if we're thinking about parks for all people, what neighborhoods are we focusing on as that is?
I think we may have we lost Michael? Well, we'll move on then. We'll hope that he comes back. And while we're waiting on him, let's turn to Haven, who is you're representing the academic community. I'd love to hear more from you, Haven, about your exciting projects and how you have been able to modernize Olmsted, if you will, on your college campus.
Yeah, so I think I got obsessed with Olmsted when and I do use the word obsessed. It's one of my new favorite words. But this obsession started when I learned that he actually designed Central Park with the plan of using grazing sheep to maintain it. So going back to your joke about use, what I've done is sort of explored this idea of using sheep to create these multifunctional landscapes. And so, you know, one of the things when Olmsted designed Central Park, he talked about grazing sheep as useful pastoral features that contributed to the aesthetic and the well-being of New Yorkers. And I think that's what sort of struck me is this idea of, you know, we've talked and we know with Olmsted about the pastoral landscape. We understand that, you know, beautiful landscapes, and we understand this sort of escape. But I think part of it that really struck me is the utility aspect of it, that he's focusing on how do you maintain landscapes? And let's show landscapes being maintained. It's not something to hide, right? He also talked about the aesthetics of those landscapes, which we've talked about, but then which we've already mentioned today is the health. And so like health of the ecological health of the landscape and sustainability, but also the health and well-being of people. And so what I've been doing in my research is we've created the UC Davis sheep mowers. And the sheep mowers are a team of UC Davis sheep. So we are an agricultural school and we have sheep on campus. And so we're actually using the UC Davis sheep mowers. And there's some slides that are going to show in the background that will show our sheep mowers. But the sheep mowers come out and they're maintaining campus lawns. And while they're doing that, so we're looking and we're investigating a number of things. We're looking to see if the sheep are as effective as lawnmowers? Can they actually do the job that you know, laborers can, and do they cut the lawn as well? But then we're also looking at like the sustainability factor, or can we reduce our carbon footprint by using sheep as lawnmowers instead of using, you know, gas powered lawnmowers? We're also looking at the ecological aspects. And with that, so bringing in mind, you know, Olmsted sustainability principles, can we fertilize the soil using some of the sheep to actually to do that? Can we fertilize? Can we bring in beneficial insects? And then the other part that we're looking at, and so I've got students working with me on all of these aspects, collecting data and seeing, but then we're looking at the health and well-being of people on campus. And can we create a landscape using the sheep that can actually reduce stress and improve sort of the health and well-being of people on campus by creating this spectacle? And so having the sheep on campus has been this amazing sort of event where people can come in, and we've turned it into, we have chairs that we bring out umbrellas, we've done watercoloring with the sheep. So, you know, sort of bringing in that Olmstedian practice of, you know, Olmsted on plein air. So people are allowed to come out and do watercolors. And so it's kind of been creating this roving band of therapy sheep. We're actually investigating, you know, how does this help? And are people, you know, less stressed, and are they doing better when the sheep are around?
So I've got to ask you, where do the sheep go at night? Do you have them stay out on campus? Do you put them in a pen? How do you do that?
Well, so that's part of this multifunctionality. I mean, these are campus sheep, and so they have their own sheep facility. So they're brought out in the morning. They come out at around 9 in the morning, and we have an area fenced off for them. They maintain the lawns all day, and then they're picked up, and I have student shepherds who are trained in, you know, animal safety and well-being and shepherding practices. And we do all have matching jumpsuits that say sheep mowers and shepherd on them, because of course. And so then we round up the sheep at the end of the day, and we send them back into their trailer, and they go home and they sleep at night. And so what we've been doing is we'll do 3 days in a row, because we found it takes about 3 days to mow the area, which is about, you know, about an acre. And so it'll take the sheep about 3 days to do that. So they'll come out for 3 days, then they'll go back and they'll do their own thing for another 3 weeks. And then we bring them back to mow the lawn again.
What kind of response have you gotten from the campus crew that generally takes care of the property?
I think they love it. I mean, we have the head of grounds, you know, quoted as saying it's the perfect partnership. You know, there are definitely people who have asked, wait, are you, you know, is this a union thing? Are you taking away union jobs with the sheep? But the reality is this is actually saving time and opening up doors for other activities. And we're really, I mean, I'd love to say that the sheep are just as effective as lawnmowers. But you know, it's still a little tricky. So it's more on the spectacle side of things than the actual effectiveness. They're good at what they do in the space that they do, but they're, you know, they're not going to take over any jobs.
Well, I want to say thank you to the academic community, which has been so engaged with Olmsted 200. We have been delighted with the work of Professor Susan Messino at Trinity, who's been looking at Olmsted and brain health, and Professor Yvonne Illette at Vassar, who has been teaching about their Olmsted landscape. So it's been great to see how different academics have engaged Olmsted 200. And this is something quite clearly we look forward to continuing and perpetuating in the new year. And it's nice to have you also, Haven, because you're representing the West Coast in our group today. Obviously, we often think of Olmsted and the East Coast, but in fact, there are many projects on the West Coast by Olmsted, as well as the Olmsted firm. Now, I understand we may have gotten Michael back into the screen, and I'd like to go back to Milwaukee if we can to revisit again some of the challenges of bringing back parks which may have not received the love, care, attention, and appreciation that they need, but that nevertheless can really provide what we just heard from Haven, can provide
Yeah.
solace, can provide restoration, et cetera. So tell us what's happening in Milwaukee, Michael.
Sure. So I think before the power went out of my office, I think a crucial part of the story of disinvestment in places like public parks is obviously there's a funding component to that, but there's also a disinvestment from history. And so the neighborhoods surrounding Washington Park, as it changed over the 20th century, you start to see less attention, obviously in the shape of maintenance or funding, but also an attention to the history of the park. And so by the end of the 20th century, as the city of Milwaukee itself is in a fiscal crisis, and in some cases that's due to the very demographics that are changing Washington Park, you have a much lower tax base. And so by the 21st century, the county park system is in a sort of perpetual state of crisis. That allows for, on the one hand, a rethinking of parks. What that's led to in Milwaukee is sort of the embrace of the public-private partnership. And as we've heard throughout Olmsted 200, that can work to the benefit of Olmsted's history and sort of to try to revitalize those histories. But it can also serve as yet another mechanism to effectively erase those histories. And so what we're trying to sort of wrestle with in Milwaukee is how do you utilize the history of these parks, the ideas of Olmsted, the history behind those ideas as a revitalization component itself. And so that's kind of at least the struggle on our end right now. How can you make these histories relevant to the 21st century? And how can that become a tool for revitalizing these parks that need that extra help?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I know that Washington Park has in the past suffered because of a freeway that was basically constructed that divided neighborhoods and divided the park. It seems that Milwaukee is not alone. Certainly the same issue is present in Buffalo, where there's an opportunity to rethink ways of bringing these parks back together and reuniting these neighborhoods that were essentially undone in the name of urban renewal. Talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, and that is one of the promising sort of developments here in Milwaukee with a new mayor who was elected last year, with this idea of trying to heal spaces that were divided by things like freeways. And so I actually had a call with Department of Transportation representatives earlier this week, where they are excited about this idea of using Washington Park itself as kind of a symbol of that sort of reunification of the neighborhood. What was fascinating about that conversation, though, was how little they understood about the Olmsted history of the space, but the idea nonetheless that they can imagine the park itself becoming a new gathering place for the community, where prior to this, it had actually, again, been divided by a multi-lane highway. And so my hope is that because there's some movement on that front, that we'll be able to sort of bring the Olmsted history, the ideas behind Olmsted into the discussion on what that park could be as it becomes something more than just a piece of the park cut off by the highway construction in the 1950s. So
I'd like to pursue with you and with Layla the point you made that we've seen in a number of parks more privatization, if you will, in an effort to try to help sustain some of these spaces that lack public investment. There's been an approach reaching out to private groups, which have in many respects supported these parks, but also have imposed fees and perhaps limited access to these parks, something that Olmsted very much wanted parks for all people. So I'd like for both of you to address that, because clearly these parks have to adapt. Clearly there are these investment challenges, but how do we balance public access and the funding necessary so that we don't end up losing that restorative openness that Olmsted was hoping for when he designed these parks? Michael, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, let me actually, Layla, could you go first? Because I'm trying to
Sure.
think something through. Yeah, sorry.
Sure. So in my experience, parks across the country, the ones that are best cared for tend to have some type of private partner, whether it's a conservancy or a friends group or be privately run. City funding just isn't cutting it really in communities across the country. And here locally, our city is imposing fees for rentals and things like that. So I don't necessarily see this as a private enterprise necessarily. We've certainly seen issues in Louisville where different user groups both want to access to the same spaces. And one of Olmsted's principles was the separation of uses. And so we've enforced that here locally. We have a master plan that we did for our natural trails, which are in 3 of our parks. And we saw a lot of user conflict between the mountain bikers and the equestrian groups. Both of them wanted more trails. And so what we did was thought back to when Olmsted designed our park system. And his philosophy was you don't have to have every element of a park in every single park. You can spread it out throughout the system. So that's what we referred back to. And we said, no, the equestrians are going to stay in Iroquois and we'll improve mountain biking in Seneca. But you don't have to have access to every single park. And that's part of the beauty of having a park system like we do in Louisville.
No, I think that's a fascinating and wonderful answer, because I know the whole issue of over programming, if you will, every park is something that we're seeing in a lot of cities. Michael, I'll pull you back in. I mean, I think this question of obviously responding to community interests, and often that may be more programming, but how do we do that in a way that we don't lose the essence of the Olmsted Park itself?
Yeah, and for me, it comes back to, at least in Milwaukee, this question of what is a public park for? And that may sound like a really basic question, but in Milwaukee, as the city, as the county explores these public-private partnerships, there's organizations that are able to come in and utilize public space to do things like restoration work. And the idea of taking a habitat or a landscape back to what someone calls sort of a pre-contact moment. And that work is being done right now in Olmsted Parks. And when I sort of draw attention to this in Milwaukee, it kind of makes me seem like I'm anti-restoration or I'm anti sort of nature programming, and that's far from the case. But the question that I hope to raise, at least in public parks in Milwaukee, is this the place for that type of work? And why I ask that, when we talk about this question of access, when some of this restoration work is done, it limits access to places in the park. It makes certain parts of the park seemingly less safe as there's overgrowth that's part of that restoration project. And so for me, yeah, it comes back to public-private partnerships are undoubtedly necessary for a cash-strapped city like Milwaukee, for a cash-strapped county. But once you sort of start to move towards that model, what are the guidelines? And how are these partners working collaboratively to make sure that this space remains public? And not only does it remain public, it remains accessible to as many of the community members as possible. And I don't think Milwaukee is necessarily there in that conversation yet. And I'm hoping that the sort of momentum begun by Olmsted 200 compels that forward a bit.
Well, in looking at Milwaukee with its remarkable system of 3 parks and the boulevard, it really does have a very underappreciated set of natural and historic assets. And so I think the opportunity to look at those holistically and to figure out how they connect and how they serve the communities is an exciting one, and one that we look forward to working on and continuing with in the near future. I want to turn to all 3 of you now and ask you, Olmsted is going to be 201 next year, and this has been a great celebration, obviously, but if you're giving advice to those who are listening in and who have participated this year about how we build on the excitement and the energy of this year, what's your advice to the park-loving public, to the citizen that lives near a park, in terms of next year and the year beyond that? Clearly, these places are not self-sustaining. They need our support. And what can we as citizens do going forward to help protect these remarkable Olmsted landscapes? Haven, I'll start with you. What can students do? What can adults do from your perspective as you look at this Olmsted enduring legacy?
I mean, I think from my end, it's about the engagement factor, and it's about creating spaces that people want to be in, and not through, I mean, what I've liked about this whole 200 celebration is that it's not this didactic thing that's just made up of interpretive signs. And it's really been super interactive with all of these really cool programs. And so I feel like that's been the benefit of the sheep, is that we've been able to create something that people just react to in a positive way, and they can learn about like labor practices, and they can learn about open spaces, and they can understand that these are places to come, and they get sort of the placemaking identity from spending time and just being there. And so I think that's the way, that's how I see Olmsted sort of moving into the future, not as, I loved your talk of the, you know, not the sepia colored and, you know, oldie timey. It's really, it's this idea of taking these principles and making them just engaging and fun. And that's the way that people want to learn, is by like experientially being part of it, not just being told this is the way we move forward, but really feeling it and wanting to be a part of it.
Right. And so Layla, you want to jump in here?
Sure. So I agree that engagement is key. And one thing that we've done is we actually took a lot of the documents that Olmsted 200 had on their website. You all had a tremendous advocacy toolkit, and we have adapted that for our park users so that people who use our parks feel empowered to advocate for more funding or changes that they want to see, improved access, different amenities, things like that. I mean, we want people to have a sense of ownership for these parks. They are literally parks for all people, right? So we want them to feel like they have a voice and have some sort of control over what happens.
Well, we've been certainly so delighted to see the varied kinds of civic engagement across the country, including a great program called Weed Wrangle, where people have come in and have helped remove invasives, something that so many public spaces are suffering from. So it's been nice to see the very diverse array of engagement, and that's something that we want to continue in the new year. How about you, Michael? What would you recommend to all of us who have engaged this year as we think about next year and Olmsted principles?
Sure. Well, I would say really dig into the histories of both the spaces themselves and also Olmsted himself. So I helped put together an exhibition on Olmsted Parks in Milwaukee at a local museum. And as I was looking for images for Washington Park, I came across a number that were related to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And one including a sort of a moment of mourning following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. And the park itself became essentially the space for that. And it had prior become a space for gathering. What's fascinating was during the summer of 2020, you saw similar gatherings following the murder of George Floyd in Washington Park. And so there was this really interesting, for me, continuity of that history. At the same time, I've been really sort of moved by the work of Sarah Zodi in connecting sort of the pre-Park Olmsted, if you will, with his work as the landscape architect who's doing things like Central Park, and her point that his experiences in seeing sort of the deprivations of slavery, and that included sort of the way landscapes were unequal, comes to inform his work when he's designing parks later in his life. And so when that history is brought out, when we do events where you have neighbors who are unaware not only of the Olmsted Park history itself, but of Olmsted himself, when they start to hear sort of that longer lineage, it can really open up spaces for dialogue. And they don't see him as simply just sort of an old dead white guy who did parks in the 19th century, that he was motivated by these ideas of, to use a contemporary term, social justice and equity and equality. And that kind of pushes the discussion, for me at least, in really interesting ways. So hopefully digging further into those histories would be my recommendation for 2023.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Sarah Zodi, who is a member of the Olmsted 200 Honorary Committee, who has been wonderfully eloquent on the history and its relevance to today. I will do a special advertisement for Visions of Reform, our very first conversation with Olmsted, where Sarah was a participant, really talking about the shaping of the land in the South and the influence of slavery on Olmsted and his views about public spaces. Really, really immensely interesting insights into how landscape architecture became shaped by Olmsted's thinking in the South. And I'll just give a shout out to Sarah, because I know she's working on a new book where she has retraced the footsteps of Olmsted in the South. We look forward to that book, and I guarantee that we will have a special program with her when it comes out. That will not be the only book coming forward. We're looking forward to Ethan Carr, who is going to be looking at Franklin Park. And it's interesting, Michael, that you mentioned the free speech aspects. And I think this is a critical component of so many Olmsted's parks and spaces. Next year, when we continue this conversation with Olmsted series, our first one will be looking at green gentrification and the challenges of displacement when we work to improve and restore some of these parks. We'll be looking at these parks and climate change. And we will have one also focusing on these parks as democratic spaces, as spaces of protest and communication. So it's good to hear from all of you the various issues that we want to continue to discuss. And I shouldn't forget sustainability. Obviously, Olmsted probably didn't use that term, but it is interesting to see how so many of his designs really did advance sustainability, whether it's using sheep or whether it was looking at the plant palette in the semi-arid West, some amazing principles that we can learn from there as well. So I want to just say thank you to all three of our fantastic panelists today, and thank you for what you're doing in your wonderful, wonderful venues. We look forward to keeping up with all of you and following what you are doing in the year ahead. I wish we could continue longer, but I want to turn back to our program. You have heard us talking a lot about not only the successes of 2022, but exciting things to come in 2023. Olmsted 200 and the National Association for Olmsted Parks intend to carry this momentum into the new year. And as managing partner of Olmsted 200, we have truly been honored to build partnerships across the country. To reflect these partnerships, we are excited to announce that we're going to have a new name. Our new name pays tribute to the hundreds of Olmsted parks and landscapes, conservancies, scholars, landscape architects, preservationists, and more who work together to advance Olmsted's principles. In 2023, NAOP will become the Olmsted Network. Between January and April, you'll notice a series of changes to our logos, emails, social media, and even websites. We appreciate your support as we make this change, and we ask you to continue to celebrate Olmsted in 2023, working toward his 201st birthday in April. Frederick Law Olmsted and the landscape architecture firm he founded have left a profound and deeply relevant legacy in the United States, as we've chatted about today. That legacy is both physical and philosophical, and we invite you to join us in 2023 and beyond as we continue the conversations begun this year on equity, access, sustainability, and democratic spaces. Before we end with a special slideshow, let me conclude by saying thank you. Thank you for your support and your energy. Thank you for investing in Olmsted Parks and Landscapes. Please join us for our next conversation on green gentrification in January of 2023. And until then, we wish you the happiest of holidays. Enjoy the upcoming show and raise a glass to Frederick Law Olmsted. We'll see you in the new year, and thanks again.